August 14, 1945. Tokyo. A single encoded transmission left Japan at 11:17 in the evening. MacArthur was in Manila when it arrived. His staff decoded it and brought it without ceremony. Document placed in front of the general, aide stepping back. MacArthur read it. He read it a second time. He set it down. He picked up his corncob pipe. He did not light it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "This is not what they think it is." The war had been called over. Japan had accepted the Allied terms. The men in his headquarters were ready to celebrate. MacArthur was reading the message again. To understand what MacArthur saw in the final surrender message, you have to understand the thing about Japan, that 4 years of Pacific War had taught him that his own government had not yet absorbed. By August 1945, the United States understood Japan's military capacity. What it understood less well, what the intelligence apparatus had consistently underweighted, was the institutional psychology of the Japanese military establishment. The specific way in which the word surrender carried different weight in Japanese military culture than in any other military culture the United States had encountered. MacArthur had been studying this for 40 years. He understood something the analysts did not, that a formal surrender announcement from the Japanese government was not the same thing as a surrender by the Japanese military. The chain of command between the emperor's decision and a soldier on a bypassed island was not a clean, unbroken line. The transmission confirmed Japan's acceptance of the Allied terms. It did not tell MacArthur what he needed to know: how many Japanese commanders in the field had received this message through a chain of command they recognized as legitimate, and how many were going to act on it. That remained unanswered. Japan's formal acceptance had been framed in a specific way, with language describing the emperor's decision as motivated by his desire to spare the suffering of his people, rather than by defeat in the field. This framing was not accidental. It was the work of the peace faction, who understood that the surrender could only be made acceptable to the military establishment if it was presented not as the conclusion of a war Japan had lost, but as the transcendent decision of a sovereign who chose peace over victory. MacArthur recognized this framing immediately. It gave the military faction a way to accept the surrender without experiencing it as the annihilation of everything they had committed to. But the framing also carried a risk MacArthur could see. If the surrender was framed as the emperor's transcendent choice rather than Japan's military defeat, then officers who had publicly committed to fight to the last retained a certain ambiguity about what the emperor's decision required of them. Had he spoken to the specific officer who had made a specific public commitment to resistance? MacArthur set the message down. He said, "We are not going to wait." Here is the specific decision MacArthur made in the next 12 hours, and why it was different from what every other senior Allied commander was doing. The formal surrender ceremony was being planned for September. The Allied command assumed that Japan's surrender announcement would effectively end active hostilities while arrangements were completed. MacArthur did not share this assumption. While the rest of the Allied command was planning the ceremony, MacArthur was planning the occupation, designing Allied presence in Japan as the active management of a transition. His first instruction was about speed. MacArthur wanted American forces in Japan before the Japanese military had time to organize any coherent resistance. He believed the window between the emperor's announcement and potential organized resistance was not weeks. It was days. His second instruction was about posture. The Allied forces entering Japan were not to conduct themselves as an occupying army. They were to conduct themselves as a transformation force. What would you have done? Standing in that room with MacArthur, having read the same transmission, would you have moved at his speed? Or would you have waited for the ceremony? Before we get to what happened in those 72 hours, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories that history books leave out. MacArthur ordered the advance party into Japan on August 28, 1945, 2 weeks before the formal surrender ceremony. He ordered it despite incomplete coordination with the Japanese side, despite objections from officers who believed the timeline was dangerously compressed. Brigadier General William Chase led the advance party. Atsugi Airfield had been agreed to be secured for Allied use. Whether it was actually secured was a question Chase was about to answer personally. Chase landed and walked out onto the tarmac. He later described the situation as irregular. Armed Japanese soldiers were present. Chase described MacArthur's instruction as clear: make contact, establish presence, behave as if everything is already resolved, because the way you behave will help determine whether it is. If the advance party arrived behaving as though they expected resistance, some of the Japanese officers present might provide it. If they arrived behaving as though the transition was already complete, most would find it easier to behave as though it was. The 72 hours that followed MacArthur's advance orders are among the most tense and underreported in the entire Pacific War. They are underreported because nothing went catastrophically wrong, and history remembers the moments when things went wrong rather than the moments when things almost went wrong and then didn't. What almost went wrong? Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki staged a kamikaze attack against Atsugi Airfield on August 18th before the advance party arrived. Ugaki had refused to accept the Emperor's surrender announcement and chose to die in combat rather than witness the occupation. There were other officers circulating arguments that the surrender wasn't legitimate. MacArthur knew this. He pressed forward anyway, because the risk of delay exceeded the risk of going in. The question was not whether there would be risk. The question was, which risk was larger? General Courtney Hodges later told his aide that he found MacArthur's timeline alarming. He said, "The general was moving as if the war was already over before it was over." The question was whether it was wisdom or recklessness. MacArthur himself arrived in Japan on August 30th, 1945. He landed at Atsugi in a plane called the Baton. He walked down the steps. He was not wearing body armor. He was not surrounded by a heavy security detail. He was wearing his khaki uniform, his aviator sunglasses, his worn cap. He was carrying his corncob pipe. The Japanese officers watching from the edges of the airfield saw a man who was conducting himself as if the war was over. Not because the ceremony had happened, because his bearing communicated it as a fact. His aide, Colonel Lawrence Bunker, wrote in his diary that evening, "The general stepped off the plane, and the Japanese officers, who had been nervous, became less nervous. I don't know how he does it. He just walks differently. Like the war being over is not a question." This is the specific competence that MacArthur possessed that cannot be reduced to strategy or intelligence or institutional knowledge. He could walk into an uncertain situation and, by the way he walked into it, change the probability that it would resolve peacefully, a quality that cannot be taught. The formal surrender ceremony on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, completed what MacArthur's advance orders had begun. But the ceremony was the ratification of something that had already happened. The occupation already underway, Allied forces already in Japan, the posture of transformation already established. He wore no medals. He spoke about civilization. When Foreign Minister Shigemitsu struggled to walk to the signing table on his prosthetic leg, MacArthur said, "Let him take his time." Some historians argue that the advance into Japan before the ceremony was MacArthur's finest achievement. Not the military campaigns, not the liberation of the Philippines, the decisions made in the 72 hours after the final message arrived while everyone else was waiting for the ceremony. Others argued that MacArthur was extraordinarily lucky, that his confidence in his own reading of the transmission was not wisdom, but the specific kind of arrogance that tends to be called wisdom when it works, and recklessness when it doesn't. Both arguments are correct. That is the problem with MacArthur. The final message that MacArthur had read on August 14th, the message that made him say, "This is not what they think it is," contained the seeds of everything that followed. The framing of the Emperor's decision as transcendent compassion rather than military defeat. The ambiguity about what the surrender required of individual Japanese commanders. The gap between the political announcement and the operational reality on the ground. MacArthur had read all of this in a single document, at a single sitting, with 40 years of institutional knowledge, allowing him to see what the analysts were not seeing. The occupation of Japan is now recognized as the most successful military occupation in modern history. A nation at war for 14 years was transformed within 5 years into a functional democracy. The institutions MacArthur built, the constitution he oversaw, the land reforms he ordered, outlasted his presence in Japan. He died in 1964. Those institutions were still functioning in the 21st century. He read the final message, and he understood what it required. Not the ceremony, not the wait for perfect conditions. It required him to move. The men who served with MacArthur in those 72 hours left a record of what they observed, not the public record of communiques, but the private record of diaries and letters written decades later. Colonel Lawrence Bunker's diary, entries from August 15th through August 30th, 1945, are among the most detailed first-person accounts of MacArthur in those days. Bunker was close enough to observe him reading the final message, and his account is the source for that specific detail. Bunker wrote, "I did not fully understand what he meant until later. He meant that the message was the beginning of a problem, not the end of one. He was already working on the problem. The rest of us were still celebrating." General Sutherland, MacArthur's chief of staff, acknowledged in a 1950s interview that MacArthur's reading of the final message was accurate. He said, "He was right that it was not over. He was right that we needed to move quickly. I would have been more cautious. He was right and I would have been wrong." MacArthur's ability to read the final message correctly was not luck. It was the product of 4 decades of study of a culture most Western military commanders treated as opaque and foreign. He was not a perfect man. He was not a consistently good man. He had made decisions in the Philippines, and in Manila, and in Korea, that cost lives that did not need to be lost. He was capable of arrogance that blinded him to the cost of his own errors, and capable of brilliance that allowed him to see things that no one else could see. But on August 14th, 1945, in a room in Manila, reading a transmission from Tokyo, MacArthur saw something that changed the shape of the peace that followed the war. He saw that the message was the beginning of a problem, and he moved across the Pacific into a Japan that was not entirely at peace, onto a tarmac at Atsugi that was not entirely secure. And what he did there became the foundation of one of the most successful political transformations in modern history. You can argue about whether it was wisdom or arrogance. What you cannot argue is that he was not paying attention. If you had been in that room in Manila on August 14th, 1945, if you had read the same transmission that MacArthur read, would you have moved at his speed? Would you have ordered the advance into Japan before the ceremony? Would you have walked off that plane at Atsugi as if the question was already answered? Tell us in the comments. The answer is harder than it looks. And if you want more stories about the man who read things in documents that other people missed, and what he did with what he read, subscribe. The next one will not be easier to answer.